There are ideas that are celebrated on stages like this, and there are ideas that are quietly buried, not because they're wrong, but because they're dangerous. Dangerous to comfort, dangerous to ideology, and dangerous to the story we like to tell ourselves. Tonight, I want to talk about one of those ideas, the kind TEDx wouldn't post. Truth is rarely what we want first. What we want first is comfort, psychological comfort, social comfort, the reassurance that the world makes sense and that we are good people living on the right side of history. Comfort tells us that our beliefs are sufficient, that our group is correct, and that questioning too deeply is unnecessary or even dangerous. Truth, on the other hand, does not care about our emotional stability. It does not ask for permission. It disrupts, unsettles, and often humiliates us before it enlightens us. And that tension between truth and comfort is one of the defining struggles of every individual life and every functioning society. Comfort is seductive because it feels safe. It offers belonging. It offers certainty. It tells us that if we repeat the right words, signal the right values, and avoid the wrong questions, we will be rewarded with approval. But the problem is this: comfort has no mechanism for correction. Once comfort becomes the highest value, error becomes sacred, because admitting error threatens the sense of safety we've built around our identity. That is when comfort stops being harmless and starts becoming dangerous. Truth operates differently. Truth demands sacrifice. It demands that you risk being wrong, misunderstood, or even rejected. It forces you to confront the possibility that your most deeply held beliefs might be incomplete or false. And psychologically speaking, that is no small thing. People don't just believe ideas, they inhabit them. Our beliefs shape our sense of meaning, our moral frameworks, and our social bonds. So when truth challenges a belief, it doesn't feel like an intellectual disagreement. It feels like an existential threat. This is why societies throughout history have struggled with truth, not because truth is rare, but because it is costly. It destabilizes hierarchies. It exposes hypocrisy. It demands responsibility. And responsibility is heavy. It's much easier to outsource thinking to a group, to an ideology, or to an institution that promises certainty in exchange for obedience. Comfort thrives in that exchange. Truth does not. In modern culture, comfort is often disguised as compassion. We are told that certain ideas are too harmful to discuss, too offensive to question, or too destabilizing to tolerate. But protecting people from discomfort is not the same as protecting them from harm. In fact, shielding people from difficult truths often guarantees long-term damage. A person who is never challenged cannot grow. A society that refuses to question itself cannot adapt. And when reality eventually asserts itself, as it always does, the consequences are far more brutal than the discomfort we tried to avoid. Truth is also deeply individual. It requires personal courage. You can't outsource it completely. At some point, each person has to decide whether they are willing to see what is actually there, rather than what they wish were there, and that decision is rarely rewarded immediately. Speaking the truth may cost you status, relationships, or opportunities. Staying silent, by contrast, often feels like the rational choice, especially when the penalties for honesty are vague, but the penalties for dissent are immediate. But here's the paradox: while truth is painful in the short term, comfort is corrosive in the long term. Comfort dulls perception. It weakens character. It creates fragility, the kind of fragility that collapses under pressure because it has never been tested. Truth, though harsh, builds resilience. It sharpens judgment. It forces us to update our models of the world, which is the only way we survive reality instead of colliding with it. History offers a brutal lesson here. Every major catastrophe is preceded by a long period of denial, rationalization, and comfortable lies. People sense that something is wrong, but saying it out loud is too disruptive, so they remain polite. They remain silent, and they confuse peace with avoidance, until the truth arrives anyway, no longer as an idea, but as a crisis. Choosing truth over comfort does not mean cruelty, arrogance, or recklessness. It means humility. It means acknowledging that reality is more complex than our narratives and that we are capable of being wrong. It means accepting temporary discomfort in exchange for long-term clarity. And most importantly, it means taking responsibility for what you see rather than hiding behind what feels good. In the end, the question is simple but unforgiving. Do you want to feel good? Or do you want to be accurate? Because when comfort becomes the goal, truth becomes negotiable. And when truth becomes negotiable, nothing solid remains. Only consensus, fear, and silence. We are told that we live in the age of free speech. The platforms are open, the microphones are everywhere, and anyone with an internet connection can speak to the world. On the surface, it looks like the most expressive era in human history, but that appearance is deceptive because freedom of speech is not measured by how many people are allowed to speak. It is measured by which ideas are allowed to survive. The illusion begins with access.
Yes, you can post. Yes, you can talk.
Yes, you can express yourself. up to a point. But what is rarely acknowledged is that speech is shaped not only by what is forbidden, but by what is punished. And in modern culture, punishment doesn't usually arrive as imprisonment or formal bans. It arrives as deplatforming, algorithmic burial, reputational destruction, and social exile. Technically, you were allowed to speak. Practically, you were taught never to do it again. This creates a chilling effect far more effective than overt censorship. When people watch others lose their jobs, their credibility, or their communities for expressing the wrong idea, they learn the lesson without being told. They self-censor. They edit their thoughts before they speak. They avoid questions that feel dangerous. Over time, the range of acceptable speech narrows, not because of laws, but because of fear. That is how free speech becomes an illusion. The rules are never written clearly, which means they are always changing. What was acceptable last year becomes unacceptable today. What was praised in one context is condemned in another. And because the boundaries are vague, people err on the side of silence. Silence feels safer than honesty when the cost of being wrong is undefined but severe. The most dangerous part of this illusion is that it disguises itself as progress. Restrictions on speech are framed as protection from harm, from misinformation, from offense. But harm is a slippery concept when it is defined emotionally rather than materially. If discomfort is treated as violence, then any challenging idea can be labeled dangerous. And once that happens, truth no longer needs to be debated. It only needs to be removed. In a genuinely free society, bad ideas are exposed through argument. They are weakened by scrutiny, not strengthened by suppression. But when speech is managed, when certain conclusions are protected from criticism, those ideas do not become safer. They become brittle. Untested beliefs don't disappear. They go underground, where they grow resentful, distorted, and extreme. Ironically, the attempt to control speech often produces the very outcomes it claims to prevent. There is also a psychological cost to the illusion of free speech. When people are forced to constantly monitor their words, they lose the ability to think clearly. Thinking itself becomes dangerous because thought precedes speech. If you are not allowed to say certain things, you eventually stop allowing yourself to think them. And a society that cannot think cannot correct itself. It can only repeat approved narratives until reality intervenes. Power plays a crucial role here. Those who control the boundaries of acceptable speech also control the direction of moral judgment. They decide which questions are legitimate and which are forbidden. And once that authority is centralized, whether in institutions, platforms, or cultural movements, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge without being labeled immoral. Not wrong, immoral. And that distinction matters because immoral speech doesn't deserve rebuttal, it deserves erasure. The illusion persists because it is comfortable. It allows people to believe they are free while avoiding the burden of defending their beliefs. It replaces dialogue with consensus and substitutes moral certainty for intellectual humility. And it flatters those in power by convincing them that their restraint is benevolent, not authoritarian. But free speech was never meant to protect popular ideas. Popular ideas don't need protection. Free speech exists precisely to protect unpopular, uncomfortable, and inconvenient truths, because those are the ideas most likely to be true when everyone else is afraid to say them. When speech is free only within approved boundaries, it ceases to be free at all. It becomes performance. The real test of free speech is not whether you are allowed to agree. It is whether you are allowed to dissent without being destroyed, and if dissent carries consequences severe enough to silence most people, then freedom exists in name only. A society that values truth must tolerate the risk that comes with open expression. That risk is unavoidable. The alternative is far worse: a culture that speaks endlessly but says nothing meaningful. A population that appears free but thinks within invisible walls. And once those walls are built, they don't need to be enforced. People will guard them themselves. Censorship does not usually announce itself anymore. It doesn't arrive with burning books or obvious bans. Instead, it operates quietly, efficiently, and politely. It hides behind neutrality, policy, and omission. The most effective form of censorship today is not telling people what they cannot say. It is ensuring that certain things are never heard. This is censorship through silence, and it is far more powerful than overt suppression because it is largely invisible. When an idea is openly banned, it attracts attention. People ask questions, they become curious. Suppression creates resistance. Silence does the opposite. Silence makes ideas disappear without a trace. No argument, no confrontation, no evidence required. The idea simply fails to circulate. It isn't shared, promoted, recommended, or discussed. And because there is no visible conflict, most people never notice that anything is missing at all. This type of censorship works by controlling visibility rather than expression. You are technically allowed to speak, but your words are quietly deprioritized, ignored, or buried beneath approved narratives. There is no dramatic punishment, just irrelevance. And for humans, social relevance is a powerful deterrent. We are deeply social creatures. We take cues from attention, feedback, and response. When speech is met with silence, it signals danger just as clearly as punishment. Over time, this creates behavioral conditioning. People learn which ideas generate engagement and which ones lead to isolation. They adjust accordingly, not because they are told to, but because they want to belong. This is how censorship through silence becomes self-sustaining. Institutions don't need to enforce it aggressively. Individuals internalize the rules and enforce them on themselves and on each other. The danger of this system is that it removes the corrective function of dialogue. In a healthy culture, ideas compete. Weak ideas are challenged. Strong ideas survive scrutiny, but silence short-circuits that process. Instead of being disproven, ideas are simply excluded, and exclusion does not make an idea false, it only makes it unexamined. Unexamined ideas don't go away, they become more rigid, more distorted, and more resistant to correction. There is also a moral distortion that occurs when silence replaces debate. When an idea is not allowed to be spoken, it is often framed as morally settled. Questioning it becomes suspect. Curiosity itself is treated as evidence of bad intent. This shifts the culture from one that values truth, seeking to one that values moral signaling. Saying the right things matters more than asking the right questions. Silence is especially effective because it preserves plausible deniability. No one has to admit they are censoring anything. After all, nothing was explicitly banned. No one was arrested. No speech law was violated. But the outcome is the same: a narrowing of thought and a shrinking of acceptable inquiry. And because the process is diffuse, spread across platforms, institutions, and social norms, no single actor feels responsible. The psychological cost of this is profound. When people sense that certain thoughts are unacceptable even to articulate, they begin to fragment internally. What they think privately diverges from what they say publicly. Over time, this creates anxiety, resentment, not just in institutions, but in one another. If everyone is performing agreement, no one knows what anyone actually believes. Silence also distorts reality itself. Public conversation shapes collective understanding. When certain perspectives are consistently excluded, society loses access to important information. Blind spots form, problems are misdiagnosed, policies are built on incomplete assumptions, and because dissenting voices are absent, failures are blamed on individuals rather than flawed ideas. History shows that silence has always preceded collapse. Before major errors are acknowledged, they are first ignored. Warnings are dismissed as inappropriate, disruptive, or alarmist. The people who speak up are not debated, they are sidelined. And when consequences finally arrive, the question is always the same: why didn't anyone say anything? The uncomfortable answer is that many people did, but no one listened. Censorship through silence thrives in environments that prize harmony over honesty. But harmony built on omission is fragile. It cannot withstand reality. Truth has a way of resurfacing, often with far greater force than if it had been addressed early, and when it does, the cost of all that silence becomes impossible to ignore. A culture that values truth must resist the temptation to disappear inconvenient ideas. It must be willing to hear things it dislikes, not because they are pleasant, but because they might be necessary. Silence may feel peaceful, but it is not neutral, it is a decision, and every decision to remain silent shapes the future, whether we acknowledge it or not. Conformity is often presented as a social virtue. We're told it keeps the peace, protects feelings, and allows institutions to function smoothly. And in small doses, that's true. Shared norms make cooperation possible. But when conformity becomes compulsory, when deviation is punished rather than debated, it begins to extract a psychological cost that is far higher than most people realize. The first cost is internal. When people feel pressure to align their outward behavior with beliefs they do not fully accept, a split begins to form. What they think privately diverges from what they say publicly. At first, this feels manageable, just a small compromise, a softened opinion, a silence where a question might have been. But over time, that gap widens. The mind is not built to sustain prolonged contradiction without consequence. The result is cognitive dissonance, anxiety, and a gradual erosion of self-trust. When you repeatedly suppress your own perceptions, you begin to doubt them. You stop asking whether your thoughts are accurate and start asking whether they are acceptable. Truth becomes secondary to approval. And once that happens, thinking itself is compromised. People don't just censor their speech, they censor their curiosity. They avoid following certain ideas to their logical conclusions because those conclusions might be socially dangerous. This leads to the second cost: psychological fragility. A conformist environment does not build resilient individuals, it builds compliant ones. When people are shielded from disagreement, they lose the ability to tolerate it. Minor challenges feel like personal attacks. Differences of opinion are experienced as threats rather than opportunities for refinement. Ironically, the more a culture insists on consensus, the less capable its members become of handling genuine diversity of thought. There is also a profound loss of meaning that accompanies enforced conformity. Meaning arises from responsibility, the responsibility to think, to choose, and to speak honestly. When those responsibilities are outsourced to an ideology or a group, life becomes easier but emptier. People follow scripts rather than values. They repeat phrases rather than articulate beliefs. And while this may provide short-term security, it leaves a long-term sense of emptiness and resentment. Resentment is particularly dangerous because it rarely stays passive. When people feel trapped in a system that demands agreement at the expense of authenticity, they begin to look for someone to blame. Frustration builds beneath the surface, often expressing itself indirectly through cynicism, withdrawal, or sudden bursts of anger. What looks like social harmony on the outside often conceals deep psychological unrest underneath. Conformity also distorts moral development. In a healthy society, individuals learn to reason ethically by grappling with complexity, disagreement, and uncertainty. But when moral conclusions are predetermined and deviation is stigmatized, morality becomes performative. People learn which positions signal virtue rather than which ones are actually justifiable. Over time, moral reasoning is replaced by moral compliance. The long-term consequence of this is a loss of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to act despite it. But in a culture where dissent is punished, courage becomes rare. People calculate risk constantly, not in terms of truth or responsibility, but in terms of social survival. And while most people can endure this quietly, it takes a toll. Living in constant self-monitoring is exhausting. Perhaps the most damaging cost of conformity is that it weakens society's ability to correct itself. Progress does not come from unanimous agreement. It comes from friction, from people willing to point out flaws, inconsistencies, and unintended consequences. When those voices are discouraged, errors persist longer and grow larger. The system appears stable right up until it fails. It's important to understand that resisting conformity does not mean rejecting cooperation or embracing chaos. It means preserving the space for honest disagreement. It means allowing individuals to speak without being reduced to caricatures or moral judgments. Psychological health depends on that space. So does intellectual progress. When people are free to think and speak honestly, they develop stronger identities, clearer values, and greater resilience. They can engage with opposing views without collapsing or lashing out. They become capable of genuine empathy rather than enforced tolerance. And that paradoxically creates a more stable and humane society. The cost of conformity is not always immediate or visible. It accumulates quietly in anxiety, resentment, fragility, and silence. And by the time it becomes obvious, the damage is already deeply embedded. There comes a point in every culture when silence stops being neutral. At first, remaining quiet feels like caution, like maturity, like choosing your battles wisely. But over time, silence becomes a habit, and then a strategy, and finally a moral position. And that is the moment when responsibility enters the picture, because once you recognize that silence has consequences, choosing not to speak is no longer passive. It is a decision. Speaking carries risk. That has always been true. To speak honestly is to expose yourself to misunderstanding, to criticism, to rejection. Words make you visible, and visibility invites judgment. In many cases, the safest option is to say nothing at all, to blend in, to let others take the risk while you benefit from the outcome. And on an individual level, that calculation often feels reasonable. Why jeopardize your stability for a principle that may not reward you? But responsibility is not about comfort or reward. Responsibility is about recognizing your role in shaping the world you participate in. Every person contributes to the moral and intellectual climate of their environment, whether they intend to or not. When you speak honestly, you strengthen the culture's capacity for truth. When you stay silent out of fear, you strengthen the conditions that made that fear necessary in the first place. The risk of speaking is obvious and immediate. The risk of silence is subtle and cumulative. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up slowly in distorted conversations, in shallow consensus, in the sense that certain things can no longer be discussed. Over time, people begin to notice that reality no longer matches the story being told. And when that gap widens enough, trust erodes, not just in institutions, but between individuals. Responsibility to speak does not mean impulsive outrage or reckless provocation. It means careful, honest articulation of what you genuinely believe to be true, even when doing so is inconvenient. It means refusing to outsource your conscience to a group or an authority, and that refusal matters because systems do not correct themselves automatically. They rely on individuals willing to point out when something has gone wrong. One of the great illusions of modern life is the belief that responsibility belongs to someone else. Experts, leaders, platforms. institutions. But history suggests the opposite. Large-scale failures are almost always preceded by widespread private doubt and public silence. People sense that something is off, but they assume it's not their place to say anything. They wait for permission that never comes. And by the time speaking becomes unavoidable, the cost is far higher than it would have been earlier. There is also a personal cost to remaining silent. When people consistently avoid saying what they think, they begin to feel smaller. Their sense of agency weakens. They start to see themselves as spectators rather than participants in their own lives. Over time, this erodes self-respect. You may avoid conflict, but you also avoid the satisfaction that comes from acting in alignment with your values. Speaking despite risk builds something internal as well as external. It strengthens character. Each time you choose honesty over safety, you reinforce the belief that you are capable of facing consequences. That belief matters because life will impose risks whether you choose them or not. Courage developed voluntarily is far more reliable than courage demanded by crisis. It's also important to recognize that responsibility scales. Not everyone has the same platform or the same level of risk. Responsibility does not mean shouting the loudest. It means doing what you can where you are with integrity. Sometimes that's a public statement. Sometimes it's a quiet refusal to repeat something you know is false. Sometimes it's asking an honest question when everyone else is pretending certainty. The goal is not to win, dominate, or humiliate. The goal is to keep the channel between reality and speech open. Once that channel closes, error compounds unchecked. And no amount of good intention can compensate for a culture that has lost the ability to tell the truth to itself. Speaking despite risk is not heroic in the dramatic sense. It is often lonely, uncomfortable, and unrewarded, but it is necessary because every time someone chooses honesty over fear, the cost of truth decreases slightly for everyone else. And every time someone chooses silence, the cost increases. In the end, the question is not whether speaking is risky, it is whether you are willing to live with the consequences of saying nothing. If there is one thing to take away from all of this, it is that none of these forces operate in isolation. Comfort over truth, the illusion of free speech, censorship through silence, the psychological toll of conformity, and the responsibility to speak despite risk. They are not separate problems. They are stages of the same process. When comfort becomes sacred, truth becomes threatening. When truth becomes threatening, speech is managed. When speech is managed, silence replaces debate. When silence becomes the norm, conformity is enforced. And when conformity is enforced, responsibility is abandoned. This is not a conspiracy. It is a pattern, a very human one. It emerges whenever fear outweighs courage and approval becomes more valuable than accuracy. And the danger is not that this happens all at once. The danger is that it happens gradually, politely, and with good intentions. By the time it becomes obvious, it feels normal. The uncomfortable reality is that no institution, platform, or movement can carry the burden of truth for us. That responsibility is individual. It belongs to each person who notices the gap between what is said and what is real. Each person who senses that certain questions are no longer welcome. Each person who feels the quiet pressure to comply rather than to think. The future of any culture depends on how many people are willing to tolerate discomfort in the service of honesty, not outrage, not cruelty, but clarity, because clarity is what allows correction, and correction is what prevents catastrophe. A society that cannot question itself does not remain stable, it merely delays its collapse. So the question is not whether this talk will be posted, shared, or approved. That's irrelevant. The real question is whether you will carry this responsibility with you when it matters, when it costs something, when it would be easier to stay silent, when no one is applauding. Because truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs someone willing to speak it.